The first thing I want to start off with is what is the book of Bereshit, of Genesis? What's it all about? And I think we have two views right from the beginning. Um, in other words, if you look at Rashi's commentary, right, the first commentary, at the beginning of Genesis, he asks, well, he comments, right, or he brings the Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Isaac, that states, in the Midrash, that the Torah didn't really have to start until Chodesh Hazelachem, which means this is your month. This is the first month of counting. In other words, it's the first national mitzvah. Until the first commandment was given to the children of Israel, till then we didn't need any of this. Why did we start here? Then he goes to give an explanation because there's a verse in Psalms that says, the power of his hands he shows to his nations in order that they get the inheritance. He showed to his nation in order that they should inherit the inheritance of many nations. So in other words, what? How is he interpreting this verse? This is a verse this is in Psalm 111. So he says it means that when the nations come and they'll say, you're thieves, you've conquered the land of 7 nations, and you tell them that the land belongs to the Holy One, blessed is He. He created it and gives it to who He chooses. So, this. I mean, I really want to focus on the question, and that is that there's a very big assumption in this question, right? The assumption is, what is the Torah all about? Specifically, what is the written Torah for, right? And if you take the written Torah, if it wouldn't have been for Rabbi Yitzchak's question, I think intuitively you may come up with a completely different answer. If you just take all the books together, I don't think it's so clear that the Torah is a book of laws. It has a lot of laws in it, for sure, but it's also a history. Does the Torah end with a law? The Torah ends with Moses' passing. And then the next book begins with Joshua. So is it only laws? Doesn't seem to be. There's a very big assumption that Rabbi Yitzchak makes, but evidently Rashi seems to agree with it. He brings it. Rashi's bringing this assumption, this question, why are we starting Torah here? The question that the commentaries ask on Rashi is that, what do you mean? Why are we starting here? Don't we have to tell you that God created the world? Where should we start from? Just in the middle? God, there's God. God, who? Who's he? Who is this God? What's he all about? We don't know anything. So, but the way actually Nachmanides explains his question is he says, this is the basis of faith, that God is the creator. So don't we need to have this? So I mean, looking at it from Nachmanides' perspective, the question doesn't really begin, does it? I mean, what's more important? That we know in other words, don't we have to start with faith? Don't we have to start from the beginning? Meaning to say, who is God? Don't we have to first understand who God is before, and I'll add another thing to it. And which I find interesting is that Rabbi Yitzchak's focus is on the fact that the nations will come and say you're thieves. So in other words, there's an ethical problem that we need to explain. In other words, what? The Jewish people, the children of Israel, given the land of Israel to perform the commandments there, most commandments, I mean, that's the primary place that the Torah is supposed to be fulfilled. So we have a huge ethical problem here. This is a place God wants a holy people to live. The nations say, holy people, you guys are a bunch of thieves. What's your right to this place? So in other words, it's a fundamental problem that Rabbi Yitzchak is pointing out, is that in the place of where you're supposed to perform the commandments and bring holiness down to earth, bring the divine down to earth, your whole beginning is corrupt. Isn't that the nation's that's the nation's claim. I mean, if this isn't a claim that has some value, why do we care? Why do we care about this claim? I mean, if we do, I mean, look at in the dealings of nations among nations, such a claim doesn't really have any validity, does it? In reality, let's face it, we're not little children here. Among nations, if one nation is powerful enough to kick another one out, and other nations are not powerful to do anything about it, game over. That's it. There's no you can get angry about. I mean, there's no like in today's politics. It only matters when you can make trouble. But if, in other words, what I'm saying is the world powers, they seem to do what they want to do, and no one complains. When smaller countries, for example, Israel, or even, they do something, now all of a sudden, then everyone can criticize them. But if you have enough power, nobody criticizes you. You can do whatever you want. You can argue with that. I disagree, but let me say it in a more simpler term: is that politics has nothing to do really with ethics, and if it does, generally, it's the ethics is to garb something else. It's to justify something. It certainly isn't ethical alone. Governments don't generally do things only on the basis of ethics. They do it also for certain self-interest. So this claim is not. In other words, what I'm saying is between Israel and the nations, is this claim really a strong claim that affects anything? Or is it the fact that they're making a claim that undermines something or is it they're bringing out a truth that we have to deal with? Isn't that really the real point? Is that how do we reconcile this point with the fact that this is going to be a holy land and for holy people? Isn't that really the thing? Whoops. Okay. I mean, if that's not the case, it seems then we return to a strange question: is that so? Wait a minute, just the end because the nations of the world have a problem, we're supposed to add a whole book to the Torah? It's not. I mean, that should be in a separate place. That's not a reason to add a whole book, because nations have come up with a question which is in reality it's hypocritical, because they all conquered from other nations and they're coming to complain about your conquest. It's hypocritical. Why do we even care about this question? No offense, but I mean, if you take any country, take your pick, it was conquered by by whoever's currently there, generally speaking. 99, there's almost no country that you can know of there was no conquest there. Obviously, the United States, Britain, France, all the Arab states. There was an Arabian conquest. I mean, so this isn't a legitimate question. I mean, it's not coming from a legitimate place. No offense, but I mean, so this must be something more here to this, and that is, like I said, that maybe there is a point we have to deal with, because maybe there's like an ethical underpinning here. If the Torah is to be fulfilled in the land of Israel, then how can it be that the land of Israel is seen as stolen? So we answer to this that no, this isn't stolen, because this was destined to the Jewish people, because the true owner is God. And God is God's decision gifted to the children of Israel. So it's not theft. That's the answer. So, okay, all right. So that's the answer in terms of that. But we have a much bigger question, which needs answering. This is what I don't understand about Rabbi Yitzchak. So in other words, what I'm saying is the premise of Rabbi Yitzchak is we have an ethical problem. Okay, Rabbi Yitzchak, I have a bigger ethical problem. What gives God the right to command us to do anything? If we don't have the book of Genesis, we don't know God created man. We know nothing. All of a sudden, God appears to Moses and says, I want the children of Israel to do such. So isn't that a bigger, I mean, in other words, if we're going to start a whole book the whole book of Genesis because ethically, the nations come with a legitimate claim. I've got another question. How are we going to begin anything without knowing God created the world? Therefore, he created man. He has a right to command him to live the way God sees fit. And in any way, God created the world and knows the proper way that man needs to conduct himself in his own creation. So wouldn't have that been a clear answer to why we have to start from Bereshit? We have to know who the lawgiver is. Who is this lawgiver? We don't know anything about him. So it's very strange. I guess you could say, I think that's part of kind of what Nachmanides is saying, is we have to begin with Genesis because we have to know who this is. We have to know who is God. We have to start from there first. So anyway, Rabbi Yitzchak should please forgive me for my disagreement. And I'm sure there's some deeper answer here that I don't understand. And look, obviously, according to Rabbi Yitzchak is basically saying there's an oral, there's going to be an oral tradition about faith that didn't have to be written down. In other words, really the book of Genesis about all this happening, we didn't have to write. This could have been an oral tradition. We didn't have to write that down. What we need to write down is the laws. That seems to be Rabbi Yisrael's opinion. And the only thing is, this is different because this has to do with where we practice the laws in Israel, and therefore we have to start from the beginning for that reason. But again, I mean, I could keep on going. I mean, that doesn't explain why we have to go through the whole story. Why do we have to go through all these details? I mean, his answer only answers one point, and that is we have to say God created the world. Okay, we could have done that in one sentence, but we give all the details. But not only that, we talk about Adam and his mistake, talk about Adam's children, talk about the generations and their mistakes. We talk about Noah, his offspring. We talk about the children, grandchildren. Finally, Abraham, and I'm talking about Abraham and his son, his grandson, his great grandchildren. Finally, we go through everything. So it's almost like he's saying, okay, look, we didn't have to mention anything. But once we have to, we say the whole thing already. I mean, that's basically what you have to say. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. But nevertheless, there is a lesson from Rabbi Yitzchak that he's teaching us that his approach is that primarily the Torah is a book of laws. And really, we have to find reasons why we should begin with this chronology, because primarily that's not really what it is, And I guess my point to you from the beginning was the way we have the Torah, the 5 books, the rest of the written law, we wouldn't necessarily know that that's the case. It seems like part of it is historical, right? So, but Rabbi Yitzchak's view does really reflect very strongly the Orthodox or traditional view of the Torah, which is that we're not as concerned with the history as we are of the substance. It's funny, we were just talking about one of my previous students who was very into the timelines and everything. Listen, no, I'm not knocking the timelines, but Rabbi Yisrael seems to be de-emphasizing that and saying we have to focus on what's pertinent for us in action, in correcting our character, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, this is a foundation, as Nachmanides is saying, is that to know that God is the creator of the world and to have that faith is foundational in terms of a person, having the proper relationship. How we follow the laws is partially to do with who's giving them and who's saying them. So having this knowledge, as I was saying before, is extremely important. And as the Rebbe said many times, since God created the world, and he gave these laws, clearly we can fulfill them. They must be harmonious with the world. In fact, not only must they be harmonious, but the world must function in a way that it facilitates fulfilling this obligation in reality. And if it doesn't, that's because that's part of the mission. So if we find difficulties, that's not an obstacle. It shouldn't be seen as something doesn't seem right here. I mean, if God wants me to do this, how come this is so hard? But it should be seen as the opposite, as clearly this is part of the mission to do it under these particular difficulties that I have. And that I will be able to overcome those difficulties for sure. Because if not, because if not, then what was the point? It's not really the right way to say it, but the right way I want to say it is that I must be able to, because the one who created all of this and is the one who is bringing about these difficulties is the one who also commanded me to do it, and he's not unfair. So there must be that I'll be able to do it. There's so many different ways to look at it, and the only time sometimes this isn't true is, for example, a person becomes ill, right? Person gets a bad flu, for an example. Happen to know someone who had that problem. They can't go to the synagogue, or they can't do certain commandments as they were able to do when they were well. So look, their obligation and mission at that time might be to take care of their health. That might be their mitzvah during that time. We have to make sure we're doing the right mitzvah. Sometimes we think we're supposed to do one, and really maybe at this particular time, maybe there's a different one that needs doing. That's a whole other discussion. But I think, in a certain sense, based on what comes our way, we can understand what is it God wants from us. Because since it's divine providence is at play, so if we have a certain circumstance, so we should realize that this is from God, and that we're supposed to make it should lead us to go on the right choice based on what circumstances come to us. All right. So, okay, I wanted to point out some other things. The first thing I wanted to point out is famously, the very first creation of light. It says that God divided and separated light from darkness, which is interesting. And it says that the Midrash tells us that God saw that this light wasn't appropriate, that it should be used for everybody. It should be saved for the righteous in the time to come. So I was thinking about the lesson of this. Just the idea that Torah very much directs us to separate things, to refrain from doing certain things, from eating certain things, from saying certain things, from doing certain things. So lest we think that this is out of disdain, this is out of disgust, because sometimes we can not want to have to do with something because out of a negative being repulsed. I guess what I'm saying here is we're setting a standard here that separation is because we cherish the thing being separate. And that's kind of the lesson here about the light, is we're not using it because we need it something very special later. And there's something there about For example, a famous example in terms of marital relations, in terms of relations between men and women. Is this something, this particular power and attraction is something to, put into exercise all the time, whenever? Or is it like light? It's something to be put aside for in a special time and in the right time, and to be used for the right people. That's what that, in other words, there's a lesson here. God is doing what? He's taking something that's very precious, powerful, and beautiful, and he's saying, not for everyone, this is for the righteous in the time to come. So, I think there's a tremendous, just basic life lesson there about how to behave with things that are precious and that are beautiful, that we should wait, put them aside for the right person at the right time. Simple lesson. Another beautiful lesson that we learned later on is the lesson about the creation of man. But before I get to that, I just want to talk about just more of almost like a feeling than, well, it's not just a feeling, it's something I think in the Mussar works, it's discussed. But if you look at, days 4 and 5, in which it says you should be fruitful and multiply, that is one place that we see God functioning. We see God's eternal quality in creation. What do I mean? In other words, having offspring and having all those offspring having offspring, those offspring have offspring, those offspring have offspring. We see the eternal quality of the divine. As you think, look, one creature, that creature itself lives a certain amount of years, or a year, or whatever it is, a fly, a month, whatever it is, 24 hours. I think someone told me a fly only lives 24 hours. Okay, but let's say whatever it is, a person lives, at best 120 years, or it may be, and they pass. So why is it that from their own cells, from their own flesh, they create something that lives past their years? How does that work? And then that thing creates another thing that lives longer after the first one is gone. How does that keep happening? How does one animal, one fish, have 1,000, what do you call it? 1,000 embryos or something? 1,000 eggs. One mother fish or something. Hundreds and hundreds of eggs. It's incredible. And they all turn into a school of fish or whatever it is. They fill the ocean with plankton, all the little fish babies and stuff. It's incredible. Truly incredible. And the Jewish thinkers of the past said this is a sign of God's infinitude. This is a sign of God's eternal quality. The life continues. It continues. It doesn't stop. Keeps on going. Similarly, the fact that we can look at, and this is obviously something that the ancients and people did do very, very easily, is they looked at these constellations and the stars, and they saw that this doesn't die. This goes from generation. It continues on. It seems to be endless. It never burns out. And then so they saw this as something very divine-like. And unfortunately, sometimes came to worship that partially because of this quality. But the fact that, it's night and then it's day, it's night and it's day, this again also continuously. Where does this energy come from? This continues on and on and on. So again, we are habituated to take all this for granted. And we're told that, it's a natural process. Things come up, things come down. The world, the sun, the different, what do you call it? The the different planetary movements and so on. But in fact, if you look at it from a more human perspective, in terms of wonderment, is quite incredible. You can explain things and say, yes, this is this way, this is that way, but still doesn't take away from kind of the amazement about the fact that these things just keep going on and on and on, and seemingly without stop, and the fact that there's the incredible vitality of life. Okay. Now, I wanted to remind you, because I know you already know about this, but I wanted to remind you about this fascinating point about how man was created, and that when man was created, it's the only time you see this. So I think it's fascinating. When we get to man, all of a sudden something changes. It's always God created this, God said this, God created such and such, God created such and such. All of a sudden it says, God said, let us make man. All of a sudden he needs a helper, needs a partner. Never had this before. Suddenly, he needs a partner. Let us make man. And Rashi comments, this is to teach us a lesson. This is to teach us modesty. It says, because since man is similar to an angel, so he wanted to ask their permission to create him, want to include them, not to insult them. I guess what he's saying is that man poses some type of competition to angels. He's very similar. And therefore, God included them. Obviously, God doesn't have to include anybody. So this is just to teach us this lesson. And what's fascinating about this is that even though this could be a very dangerous lesson to teach, right? Let me read the language of Rashi because it's quite interesting. He says, let us make man, even though they did not assist him in his formation at all. And this will open up a place for heretics to rebel. Because it says, let us make man. It implies that, there's more than one creator of man here. This is unbelievable. Still, the scripture did not refrain from teaching us the proper way of conduct and character of humility. That the one who's of a higher status should take permission from the one on the lower status. Person should ask permission. So in other words, it's and this has become actually, in certain contexts, this has become a common practice, meaning to say, for example, you're going to give a speech. Person asks permission from the listeners. Sometimes it is from people of a higher status, but the lesson here is to ask permission even from those of a lower status. So what an incredible lesson. Here, we're putting at risk the fundamentals of faith to teach this lesson about humility, of how to speak in a polite way. It's very fascinating. So far, you wouldn't, and this should teach teachers a lesson. To teach teachers a lesson too, because, people who get very zealous when it comes to faith, they can become very nasty. They can start calling people names. And here we see that God himself said, let's calm down. Let's do this together, even though it wasn't really doing it together, but he wanted them to feel like he's doing. So it's a tremendous, tremendous lesson. And I don't think it's for nothing that this is specifically with man's creation. First of all, it has to do with what was mentioned before, that because this was something that particularly was sensitive to the angels, and so it had to be. In other words, this was really the biggest part of the project. So here's where we really mattered, right? Now this is really where where other parties could be hurt, that they weren't involved in such an incredible work. So therefore, not to embarrass, not to hurt their feelings, God made them feel like they're getting involved. But again, I think it's a tremendous lesson of how careful we have to be with how we treat others and to be humble, that even in the face of religious concerns, that humility has to come, not to hurt somebody's feelings. I mean, here the Torah itself does it. The Torah itself does it. We're putting at risk that heretics might misunderstand, and we're taking that risk in order to teach the other lesson is more important. The person has to take a lesson that if you're doing something that others may be hurt by the fact that you have such an accomplishment, you know what? You should include them. Include them, maybe feel that they're somehow part of it. And that lesson was more important than letting us know for sure that was only God involved in. That's incredible. Tremendous lesson. Again, it's a really good lesson to zealots. That to be very careful not to how you speak to people, and to behave in a humble way, even if it's on a religious topic, even if you're talking about faith itself. Don't rush to attack, evidently. I mean, at least think very carefully how you treat human beings, even though you're talking about fundamental issues of faith. So that's what we're talking about here. And still, our first concern was to teach a lesson about humility before anything else. So, yeah, I think it's a big lesson. And we see, just in terms of other things, we see it says that they asked the question, why is it that Ahab, in Hebrew Achav, why is it that during his reign he would go out to war and he would succeed? How is that possible? He was an idolater. He was a terrible idolater. So how is it he went out to war and he was successful? Why did God help him? And the Talmud tells us that he succeeded because in his time there was peace among people. At the end of the day, there was peace and there wasn't slander. And because of that, he succeeded when he went out to war. And others who were more religious generations failed, where he succeeded in terms of going out to war. So we learn a tremendous lesson about the importance about peace, the importance about character between other people. Sometimes God may prefer those qualities to zealous religious qualities if it comes to poor character. So, what people say, maybe they're not so off in a certain sense. Like people say, like, well, I'm not so religious, but I'm a good person. Well, maybe there is something there a little bit. God really does value that a lot. We see that over here from this verse. Humility and, not hurting someone else's feelings. And I think also there's another point here, which is that it's all part of the same thing. The thing is that when religion, doesn't have to only be religion, but religion is similar to other ambitions or ideals in that they compel a person, or how should I say, more like propel a person towards acting, and it gives a person a lot of excitement and feels that they have a lot of purpose and pushes them to do certain things. But that's why you have to be careful, because in other words, you may feel like, in other words, the feeling of being right can often push a person to do things that are, not so good. It's the famous expression, right? What does it say? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Isn't that the famous expression? So I guess that's the same idea. Like when a person feels like he's in the right, suddenly he can really, if he really has this passionate feeling that they're right, he's right, can really, stampede through a lot of people getting there. So this is what we have to be very careful about. Where's the point that sometimes we do have to, fight with other people And what is that point? I wish I was wise enough to say where that was. It's certainly the point in the language. The lesson here is that our first approach must be to try to behave with respect. And we can, I think also there's a point that we can speak firmly, we can speak directly, but we need to speak respectfully. And we've seen a similar thing with Moses in Egypt. It says he spoke to Pharaoh respectfully and recognized he was a king, even though he was, going head to head with him. Still, he behaved in a respectful manner. And that's very important. That's something also people maybe it's hard for people today to understand. Disagreeing doesn't mean you can't disagree just because we have respect for other people. But we have to act with respect. Show people dignity, show people you recognize another person as having value, despite the fact that they may be doing something that's really, really wrong. Okay. Any questions or comments up to here?
Yes, Rabbi, I have 3.
Oh,
So for the question of why the Torah starts with Bereshis and not with the first mitzvot, as a non-Jew, I view the first part all the way up to maybe all of Genesis, maybe even into part of Exodus, as creating a basis for the Torah for the nations. It gives the general concepts, basic laws that all of the nations need to follow. And then it hones down specifically onto the Jewish people being separated out with their own special set. So as a non-Jew, I think that the first part is for us.
that's wonderful. And I agree. I think it's true. And 100%.
So that was my first comment. My second
It's a
comment
wonderful comment.
is so we're studying Hebrew. And so I was looking at Genesis 1:26. You were talking about God including other people, or I mean, other creations in his creation of man.
Right.
I was noticing that it's Vayomer Elohim, and then the rest of the verbs are plural. I mean, everything else is plural.
Right.
The Naaseh is the plural, and
Yeah.
but so all of those other words are plural. But the first word, Vayomer, is third person singular.
Right.
So that if you actually look at the Hebrew, that shows that God singular is including other people. It'd be like Sandy's, like me saying, Sandy said, let's have a class together. So it's she singular,
Yeah.
but including all of us.
Yeah, which really brings out the lesson even stronger. I mean, if I can translate the verse for you, and I'm glad that you pointed out exactly which chapter and which verse it is that I was discussing. It says, and God said, "Let us make man, right, in our form, in our image, and he will rule over the fish in the sea, the birds in the heavens, the beasts over the land, and everything creeps and crawls on the earth. That's the verse, pretty much.
Yeah.
So it's God speaking and saying, yeah, let's do this. Let's do this. And so what Rashi points out, though, is that, oh, by the way, and I'm really actually quite glad you pointed this out, because the next verse it says, and God created man. So Rashi points this out also to say that even though there's a little confusion in verse 26 of chapter 1, verse 27 straightens it out and make sure you realize it's just God did it. It wasn't, it was a manner of behaving, it was a manner of speaking, it wasn't, actually, it wasn't really, this wasn't actually a joint project at all.
Right. Exactly. So it's nice to look at the original and not any of the translations. I think that has helped me a lot to learn a lot. So my third one is a question. So my third one's a question for you, and it's opinion. So just your opinion. If the creation of the whole universe is, or the creation of the earth is for mankind, I mean, that was kind of like the goal, the ultimate, created everything for man. Why didn't man get his own day? Why did he have to share his birthday, his creation day, with beasts and cattle and creepy things? Your opinion.
Well, at the same time, we do see that it's a completely different. It's not. It's not from one of. It's not from one of the earlier commands. In other words, it's not. He isn't one of the beasts. There is the instruction. God speaks and creates the beasts of the earth, and actually makes them. And then there's a new statement: let's make man. I'm not sure if I have such a good answer. Except to say that, I mean, I can just say this little background, and again from our tradition, is that a man is being pulled together. He's the last of the creation, and is also from the first. In other words, he's this composite of the soul and the body, and the body itself is actually, it's explained that it's actually it's lower, even than the animals, in that the animals were brought forth from the earth. Man was literally carved from the mud, so to speak, whatever all this exactly means, so that Adam's composite is from the lowliest and the highest. So in other words, I don't know if it surprises me that he's made on the same day as the animals, because in a certain sense, part of him is animal, and part of him is angelic, which will explain why God is speaking to the angels and said, let's make man. Because the spirit part of him, it has to do sort of, it's kind of like, in the same realm as the angels. As it discusses in mystical works, that there's worlds of angels, worlds of souls. So there are spiritual states of existence, there are spiritual realities, and they may even be able to interact with each other, souls and angels. I mean, we do know that there are certain angels that accompany the soul on its journey after it leaves the body. So evidently they can interact. So that's pretty much as good as answers I can give. I don't think it's really it's not a full answer. except that I'm just saying I'm not surprised, because I think the point is the body part is meant to be, similar to animals, and which is exactly what we find. I mean, the human body has many similarities to the animals. So, but you're saying another interesting thing, though. You also made mention of that everything was created for man. Now, was it? I mean, where do we see that this is the case? We see that man, in fact, was created for the earth. What do I mean by that? What does it say in the next chapter, in chapter 2? It says man was placed in the garden, right? Why? He's placed there to work, to guard it and to work it, right? So I gotta find that verse. And that's in chapter 2, verse 15. And God took man and placed him in the Garden of Eden in order to work it and to guard it. So in essence, just looking at the text, doesn't seem like the world was created for man. It seems like man was created for the earth. How can we reconcile this? Is there another place where we will learn that this is not the case? Where do we learn that actually the world was created for man? I think without tradition, we might not. I mean, here, we'll put it this way: we see it from the fact that in chapter 1, what we see is man was given the right to rule over all of the creatures of the earth. So this implies that he has the right to exploit all things. He's going to be the ruler. So, by the way, Nancy, there's also a question. I mean, if you look at verse 27, and really even 26 itself, I mean, it's kind of hanging, it's just hanging there. We're on day 6, it says that, God brought forth from the earth all the different beasts and creatures and so on. And then it says, God saw that this was good. And then it says, and God said. So I guess the assumption is, and we know this was on the 6th day, but it is something new. It's something entirely new. We finished. God has created all the beasts of the field, and then he's kind of taken a look at it and said, this was good. So what does that tell you? It's kind of a pause. So that job is done. Now we're doing something else. So there is a separation, a dividing line between animals and man.
Rabbi, could I just put some speculation in here, just
yeah,
on this? Maybe he was made on the same day. I mean, he was made, like you just said, to have dominion over the animals and everything. He was made in the image of God. He's got a higher soul than the other animals have. So maybe God did not give him his own day of creation and made him the last thing of creation to keep him humble. You could say, well, I'm made in the image of God and I've got this high soul and I'm, and could get very arrogant maybe. And I remember in a lecture from another rabbi at some point made the statement that if man gets too arrogant, God could say, wait a minute, the gnat was made before you. So maybe maybe there's something in there so we don't get too arrogant about our status in the order of things. I don't know.
Yeah.
Speculate.
That definitely, yeah. We learn from that statement that the fact man's created at the end can be used as a way to humble him. I want to make another comment, based on something that Rashi says here, adlak, as they say right here on location, is that he says that God didn't want there should be jealousy in the acts of creation. So what do you mean? What does this mean? It means that that's why we have this fashion. In other words, first day, there has to be creations for the heavens, creations for the earth. Heaven, earth, heaven, earth, heaven, earth has to be equal. And so man is kind of equals it out because he's partially from heaven, partially from earth. And so there's no jealousy. But that might also be why, like, both he's created on the same day as the animals, that the animals are the earth and he's the heavens, at least partially. And so there shouldn't be any jealousy as far as why it needs to be equality. As far as, I mean, the first day is light. I don't know if that's heaven or earth, but then we have the firmament is heavens, right? And then we have vegetation. We have, and then on the fourth day we have the constellations, the sun and the moon, so that's heavens. And then on the fourth day, that was the fourth day. And then on the fifth day we have different animals on the earth. And then that's the fifth day. On the sixth day we have to have both. So, to make sure that heaven, earth is kind of a balance between heaven and earth, heaven and earth, heaven and earth. So maybe even within the sixth day itself, there's a balance with animals and man, heaven and earth. There's a kind of a balancing that makes sure that we have some of both going on. And man is a composite of both. Okay. Well.
And Rabbi, going back to at the beginning, you were talking about why do we have the Genesis story, the beginning and all that before any of the mitzvahs? Maybe rather than starting in Leviticus, we started where we did. And the thought occurred to me, maybe we had to have the creation story to establish God's authority. So when the mitzvahs and commandments do come, he says, I created everything. It's mine. I have the right and the authority to guide it and tell you what to do with it. So maybe showing us who the creator is establishes his authority for later. Does that make sense?
100%. Yes, 100%. It doesn't seem to be, I mean, it was actually part of a question I asked earlier. It's like, why doesn't Rabbi Yitzchak embrace that view? Why it seems like that might be even the more logical approach is to say that, because Rabbi Yitzchak's question is like, we have this ethical problem, and I brought up, and so I think I brought up a very similar point, and that is that if Rabbi Yitzchak is worried about ethical questions of interfering with us keeping Torah, why are we keeping Torah? Doesn't Bereshit deal with that, which is what you're saying? We have to understand what obligates us to keep Torah. The answer is because God is the creator, and so he has the right to, he created us, he has the right to command us into how to live. He gave us life, he gave us everything. And also he designed the world, and so he knows how we need to conduct ourselves in the world he created. Yeah, so it's really vital to bring this out. I think the only thing I can say is maybe the point is that these type of things, books maybe don't help. Like, I guess the question is a book maybe the point to understand the approach of why that's not an answer. is that those who feel that it's not, we didn't necessarily have to have this in a book, is because books don't make people have faith. Maybe they believe that approach, although you could disagree. I mean, it seems like books have helped people strengthen their faith. Just anecdotally speaking, people read Torah and it does strengthen it wakes something up. So, but that might have been the underlying point of the question. Is you're right, it's a fundamental faith, but faith and books are not synonymous. I mean, we don't have to get faith from books. We live in this generation now where everything is like online. Everything is a written or a picture or a video. But people used to give over the most important things in their lives orally, from parent to children and grandparent to grandchildren and so on. Most important lessons weren't given in a book. Books were for laws and things like that, official documents, and maybe that's really the underlying part of Rabbi Yitzchak's question. Is like, this is a book. Why is it in the written Torah? Not the why is it in of course it has to be in the Torah, but why is it in the written Torah? This is something that we could have given over. Why is it written down? Laws need to be written down. People don't like keeping laws. Stories, we didn't need a book for stories. People could have given over the story, right? Does that make sense? Again, we live in a world that's so different in the way I think, and maybe it's in some way a little less human, because giving over a story, and sometimes you will actually hear people talk about this, how earlier societies, told stories and how important that is. And maybe that's his point. This should have been a story, not given over. Maybe. But nevertheless, at this point, this is the case. The Torah is Bereshis is very important because it establishes God as the creator. So whatever the original reason for it is, and I think it's a lot goes way I think there's a lot deeper mysteries than simply what Rabbi Yitzchak appears to be telling us. But nevertheless, it's now it does represent this testament to God creating the world, which is so important as a tenet of faith and a tenet of proper conduct, upon which we can build everything else for sure. So, okay. There's certainly a lot to say. I'll just finish off with one comment because it had to do with something, just to wrap up something Nancy said. And that is, strangely enough, where do we actually learn that the world was created for the sake of man? In my opinion, from the flood. From the worst catastrophe, we learn the greatest gift, right? Because, like I said before, we knew Adam was created, it says, to work and to guard. He's had a function. But suddenly, when people are really misbehaving, God says, you know what? I don't need the world anymore then. So that's how we see, no, the world was created for man. And if man is not fulfilling, is completely corrupted his path, then we don't need any of it. So this is exactly what the commentaries say on that story. Where God says, if this is the case, then I don't need any of this creation. So counterintuitively, from the greatest downfall, we also have the greatest hope, because it teaches us, how important human beings actually are. It's not just, again, it's not just a vindictive punishment. It's and to the other extreme also, when God minimized and said, no, well, the world will keep going. In a certain way, it's a disappointment in a certain sense, if you think about it. I mean, it's very hard to take it, but the point is, if God's saying, no, you don't, because really, think about with your spouse, okay? Let's put it to you that way. A person's in a husband and wife, and the spouse says, if you get really angry, it's okay. I don't really care. I'm all right. I'm just going to continue doing what I'm doing. Doesn't bother me anymore. that's kind of a little feels bad, because then so what that's the disconnection. With it, then there's more of a distance. Then doesn't really matter anymore. Just whatever, you know. And so the fact that God is saying, if you man really misbehave, it doesn't matter. The world will just continue on. That's kind of that's an extremely a letdown in a certain sense. I mean, well, God's saying, I can't trust you to, you know, in a certain sense, the message is, I can't put the full, the full both responsibility and entitlement in your hands anymore, because I can't trust that you'll be able to sustain the world based on yourselves anymore. I'm gonna have to just keep it going regardless, and wait until we have a generation that can do things properly. Meantime, I'll just keep it going. I'll keep the lights on until the right customer comes. That's all. That's what it seems to be saying. So it's kind of it's a bit of a disappointment. It's kind of like Noah. You could say on the other hand that it was because of Noah's great merit that God kept the world going, but in a certain sense, it's a little bit of a disappointment. It really is saying that, and that's why you find Abraham, because God is kind of saying, man as a whole is not going to be the center anymore. It's not going to be the steering wheel of the universe. I can't do that, and I decided I'm not doing that anymore. Or again, I mean, the truth is, did God really change his mind? I don't, that's something to delve into another time and another day. But that is what we see, that there's some kind of a shift with Noah, right? Where God says the world is going to continue regardless. There's a dramatic shift. So what happened? So is man the center or not? So you see what I'm saying? And this also explains, obviously, another thing is why Israel suffered so much. I mean, at least from a simple perspective, point is that God has scrutinized them. God is scrutinizing them more. And that's a little bit, it's a kind of a compliment. Point is, no, you really matter. You really matter, and you got to stay on track. And what you do really counts. It's not like whatever. Yeah, some other doesn't really, not really that interested. It's kind of like it's kind of like, actually, I think there is midrashim about this. It says, look, just like other nations, like other people's children or something like that, like the children. It's not, God isn't that concerned with it. It's not. But when your king's own children misbehave, that's intolerable. That he has to do something about it. So it's a heavy responsibility. And but he also has to give us the direction, the strength, and the education, and the ability to. It's a tough. It's not an easy task with all the struggles and challenges. All right. Anyway, I digress. But I think it's profound idea about the flood, though, from where we learn it. Again, it's how do we take this into our own lives? Is that sometimes when we have difficulty and we think, why is this happening to me? Why is God doing it to me? And and so on. I see people that are not so great and everything's fine, and why me? Or such things. And maybe in reality, we would only be able to take a little deeper again when you get past the pain and disappointment, take a little deeper look at things and realize that, maybe because I matter. Maybe that's why. Okay. Have a good night.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank
Feel
you.
better.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you both. Thank you for. See you next time, God willing. Everything should go well. Good night.